Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this wonderful November Rise and Grind session. We're gonna have a great session with Professor Kai-Shang Lee he's assistant professor who's previously pursued a career in pastry, culinary, and specialty coffee. So a lot of love over there. And his research interest really lies in the intersection among philosophical, aesthetics, and gastronomy. So today we're going to talk about a topic on qualitative horizons confronting dangerous misconceptions. So, Sean, please take it away.
All right. Hey guys. I've been told that I was going to be your 10 a.m. Eastern Time entertainment. I'm just gonna give you out a few caveats. I am a early career researcher, so please take you um whatever that is presented today for a grain of salt, really as a grain of salt. There is no right or wrong answers. It's really all up for debate. I really have about 40 minutes planned, 30 to 40 minutes planned with a couple of activities in between. All the activities doesn't really require a video operations or audio. Just type it into the chat box and that's all facilitated right there. Hopefully it will be a fruitful session together. And really today's presentation, hopefully you can all see my screen. It's about confronting some dangerous misconceptions. It's really divided into two large parts. The part one, we're going to talk about thinking qualitatively. We're going to define qualitative inquiry in three ways: as an adjective, as a method, and as a methodology. We're going to define what I mean by a dangerous misunderstanding, and we're going to see how that has, in some ways, creeped into the whole methodological terrain in our field, specifically in the hospitality field. Again, my name is Sean. I go by Sean. Unless there's another Sean in the room, I go by Kai Sean. I have a PhD in business administration from Oklahoma State. I've been an assistant professor. This is my third year at the University of Tennessee. My research areas are in philosophical aesthetics and gastronomy. And what does that mean? It basically means I study the nature of good food and good eating. And what does good mean to different people, relatively speaking? My teaching areas covers a broad spectrum of culinary fundamentals, baking and pastries, my favorite, to showpiece design, and of course, qualitative inquiry at the graduate level. And I proudly call myself a wine enthusiast, meaning I like to drink wine and whine about life. I do come from a very unique intersection. My advisor, even though I was housed in the Department of Hospitality and Tourism, my advisor was not from the department, but from the anthropology department. So I was basically advised for a good 6 years by a master's throughout a PhD program by a critical scholar and an anthropologist. And with that, I really believe that I have a set of theoretical buddies that always follow me. And I believe that theories are the theorists, the idea that they are inseparable from one another. When we say a social theory, we basically cannot separate the theorist away from the theory from the origin of the theorist. And the four images that you see today from John Dewey, that's really my biggest theoretical buddy, following him on his aesthetics, philosophy, and experience and growth. Anthony Bourdain on all things food, gastronomy, and travel. Saldania, modern-day pragmatist, recently retired, and the late Syed Hussein Alatas, a critical scholar and politician from Malaysia, and I am Malaysian by passport. So what do I mean when I talk about confronting qualitative misunderstanding? I think it's very important to set a definition out front. Throughout this presentation, I'll be using the term dangerous misunderstandings really interchangeably with the word misconceptions to signify the falsehood and fallacies that we have about qualitative inquiry that tends to circulate around our journals and our scholarly walls. These misunderstandings, if continue to be left unchecked, unchallenged, can really risk crystallizing into unchallenged falsehoods. So let's talk about a few misunderstandings that we will look into today. Number one, a very common misunderstanding is that qualitative inquiry or qualitative research is interviews, and interviews is nothing but qualitative research. A very simple flaw there that we'll unpack throughout the presentation. The idea that good qualitative research must achieve some form of saturation. I believe saturation is a false gold standard for inquiry, and I will talk about that later as well. The idea that subjectivity is really an enemy to rigor and that it has to be controlled, minimized, or even eliminated from the inquiry. And last but not least, a systemic one that goes down into our curriculums is that qualitative inquiry can be taught in one single graduate level course alone. The real problem why I believe some of these misunderstandings are widely perpetuated is not really because qualitative inquiry is underdeveloped. It is not, but rather is highly undertaught and mistaught, and therefore underappreciated in our curriculums. There are two common ways that we are typically introduced to qualitative inquiry by. First, if you can remember your first qualitative research course or a research course in general, we typically first pin qualitative inquiry against the quantitative counterpart. And second, we tend to overemphasize on the philosophical differences. We see the words ontology, epistemology, axiology is all shared during the first lecture or the first 3 lectures during the introduction of qualitative research. Now, I'm going to pass the ball over to you for a second. We're going to unpack the first way qualitative research is typically introduced to a novel researcher or an early career researcher or a student learner. I want to hear from you guys on the Zoom function. If you can access the chat, let's do a little finger activity and let's type in some key characteristics that distinguishes quantitative and qualitative inquiry, almost like you're in the classroom on day 1 all over again. Let's spend about 60 seconds on the chat box. What are some key differences between qual and quant? Some very shy fingers so far. Sample sizes, great. Qualitative is interpretive. We're dealing with numbers. We're dealing with time. I like that. We're dealing with time, quickness of the data, discovering the why instead of the what, deeper meanings, generalizability. That's typically a big one. Very nice. Okay, I'm assuming numbers versus context. I love that. Now, anyone can do qualitative. I know where that one came from. When we think about qualitative, that tends to be the way it's introduced. It's always pinned against the quantitative realm. A lot of us will probably be introduced to a diagram of sorts where the professor will approach the whiteboard and draw a dividing line down the whiteboard. On one side, she will write quantitative, and on the other, qualitative. Immediately, the differences can start to appear. On one side, we talk about numeric data versus non-numeric data. On the other, we talk about the nature of the design. One is deductive, the other is inductive. One is more structured and the other is open-ended in terms of the way we operationalize the methods that we use. Sample sizes, some of us mentioned about that. Qualitative tends to be much more smaller as compared to the hundreds or preferably thousands in quantitative. The idea of generalizability versus transferability. And of course, what qualitative, we talk about the interpretive element, it really is about whether the researcher is involved or how involved he is in the interpretation versus an uninvolved, distant researcher. This is the most common way qualitative inquiry is introduced in our field, and I would argue this is also the first dangerous simplification that we tend to perpetuate. The reasons because the moment we create a bifurcating line, we can either create 2 problems. One is we start to initiate what I like to call methodological reductionism. What does that mean is that we only take interviews as an equivalent to qualitative research, or we make the assumption that qualitative research has no inclusion of quantitative data whatsoever. Sometimes we take the means and mistaken it for the greater project. And in the classroom, the moment we start to create this, sometimes we also create some false biases that some people might actually believe, oh, qualitative research being more subjectivity driven is less thereof compared to the quantitative counterparts. And we will unpack this a little bit more. And in truth, there really isn't one better than the other. There isn't really the dichotomy really shouldn't be there. We should be embracing both sides of the narrative to really come to a better understanding. Now let's go to the second way qualitative research tends to be introduced, what I like to call being overwhelmed by the isms or ologies. Here's a quote from Higgs and McAllister. And they mentioned that when you are a novice researcher, you often tend to get lost in the literature when beginning to understand qualitative research. Why? It's conceptually dense. It can be conceptually foreign and has very conflicting use of terminologies. When you first embrace qualitative research, if you pick up a textbook, you might be first bombarded by terms of epistemology, post-qualitative feminism theory, queer theory, and all the other ologies and isms. Johnny Saldana, probably a synonymous name to qualitative research, even have put together a very nice article discussing about the isms and ologies and where he stands on the matter. As a quote, he mentioned that some people proudly call themselves a post-structuralist, a critical theorist, or some other fancy $5 term. You can certainly make a life's work really studying all about that stuff. But if that's all you do, it kind of limits who you are and what you can accomplish. I keep on thinking about some old dumb hound dog chasing its own tail round and round and round, Saldana says. It looks like fun, but he really ain't getting anywhere, isn't he? If you call yourself post anything, you need to bring it down a notch. That was his whole statement in that article. Now, I'm not trying to discredit the importance of understanding the isms and the ologies. They are absolutely important. But if you introduced it to a novice student that way, it can be very foreign. It can be overwhelming, and it can even make the student disinterested. The moment you create that disinterestedness, we've lost them. And I argue that this is one of the biggest reasons that some scholars tend to deter away from qualitative inquiry altogether. At this point, I think it's a good time to even define qualitative. And being a Deweyan, I love the particular quote and particular from this particular essay, Qualitative Thought, in the way he defined qualitative, that the world in which we live in is preeminently a qualitative world. It's ineffable unless consumed in whole, and completely unquantifiable unless reduced to do so. I find it very useful to interpret Dewey's term using an art analogy. Particularly when we say a painting, for example, has a particular artist quality. Maybe it's a Rembrandt, maybe it's a Picasso, maybe it's a Banksy. We are really referring to the overall style of the artist, not a particular line, not a particular brushstroke, or a particular use of color. We are referring to the qualitative whole of the artist's style, the entire unity that constitutes the artist's quality. I like to use the example from the artwork from Brian Tai. If we look across all three artwork, we really cannot reduce it down to a particular brushstroke or a particular use of color. Yes, you may choose to do so, but in that case, you are reducing the whole project. You are reducing the three artifacts. But if you look across them, you can see that there is a threading qualitative quality that really threads and bind these three artwork together. And that's only best described as the quality of Brian Tai. And that's what I'm trying to say. Qualitative, we take into consideration the whole, the context, the situations. We're taking into the unity of a particular situation. We don't necessarily fragment the situation, or we risk rendering it down to nothing but debris. But in the research world, we tend to use qualitative in really three main ways. And this is probably a very good scaffolding tool to move forward to the next part of the research presentation. We tend to use them as an adjective. And what I mean by an adjective, it's really, we're just referring to something, an aspect of a particular item, a particular object or situation in its unquantifiable manner. For example, we may make a statement like Sylvia's report provided some good qualitative insights about the health of the business, the fiscal health of the business. We may also say, for some of us who have been on campus interviews, we may even say that the two candidates are identical in qualification, but there's a strong qualitative differences between them. Now, in this case, the term qualitative is definitely used in a grammatically correct way, in a semantically correct way, but it doesn't necessarily describe qualitative in the context of a research approach or design, but it is an appropriate use of the term qualitative in everyday speech. Moving up the ladder, we have qualitative as a method. When used to describe a method, we see qualitative take on a particular technique or tools used to specifically collect or analyze non-numerical data. The emphasis is on non-numerical data. Now, qualitative methods typically encompass certain steps and strategies as well to meet certain objectives. For example, a person might use semi-structured interviews that would qualify as a method. A person using field observations will also qualify as a method as well. And as we move further up, we have qualitative as a methodology. When we use it as a methodology, we are really referring to the overarching framework or philosophy that guides and permeates and pervades the entire research process. It includes a selection of methods, it includes the interpretation of data, but more importantly, it also comes with specific philosophical commitments. I want to give you a real example by a couple of scholars, Victor Doffler and Mark Styron. Mark is a chef by trade, a Michelin star chef by trade. And in this particular inquiry, the research team adopts the methodology of phenomenology to try to understand the essence and essentials of how elite chefs engage in creativity. The approach informs and even commands the researcher to bracket their own assumptions, adopting an attitude of openness and curiosity to really understand how creativity emerges in their fullness. The goal, being a phenomenology, is not merely to document the creative practices of these chefs, but really to also distill the essentials of what it means to be in the culinary creative process. Of course, you carry out certain methods underneath this large framework. So the research team interviewed, observed, and even collect specific documentations of their signature dishes to really see the unseen mechanics of the creative process. The moment we say something is a methodology, it really embarks on a whole different dimension, something more latent, something more higher order that informs everything else. To really give a quick some definitional matters to the term qualitative methodologies and qualitative inquiry as a whole, Robert Stake mentions that it's really a theoretical inquiry that studies how specific things work. Really through the lens of the human perception, the inquirer is always inseparable from the inquiry. And of course, we've covered this already before. What really makes qualitative research qualitative is the emphasis on non-numerical data. Hopefully, that covers quite a bit for now. I'm going to map up the terrain of qualitative inquiry and before we dive into our next activity. Now, when we talk about qualitative inquiry, it's also important to note that it is not monolithic. It is a wide variety of genres, best described as a buffet of a terrain. On one side, you might see more post-positivist methods, and the other, you might see more interpretive method. If this is the first time you ever encountered this term, its positivism is more inclined to designs that are more that are more conventional in terms of the way social sciences are conducted and the hard sciences are conducted. We might see them in survey designs, we might see experimental designs under this realm. We also will see more deductive qualitative research approaches under this realm. On the interpretive side of the world, typically is labeled the qualitative paradigm. And we start to see more emergent inquiries in that nature, start to see more narrative projects emerge too, each of them having their own philosophical commitments. Phenomenology is also packed under this realm. Grounded theory, I would argue, parks under this gray area in between, because it does adhere to some nature of the positivism paradigm, that the whole idea is to systematically formulate a robust theory. Case studies, the study of particularities, falls under this middle realm as well, unless you follow, and they can sway from left to right. For example, if you want to approach a case study more objectively, you probably adopt the Yin tradition developed by Robert Yin. There's also a more interpretive tradition developed by Robert Stake. And it doesn't help that they're both named Robert, but there's definitely also just showcases how different approaches can be adopted by adhering to different philosophies. Ethnography tends to actually stem from a really positivist lens, where the researcher tends to be a very distant inquirer. The goal is to really report from an outsider's perspective, or what we call an ethic perspective. Today, ethnography has really moved to be more reflexive, more woven, and more decolonial, trying to capture things from an insider's perspective. And if this is not confusing enough, mixed method is also parked under the center, where we start to see explanatory designs come out on one end, but also we also have qualitatively driven mixed methods on the other. Again, this is just the plurality of the qualitative terrain. To make matters worse, this is not a simple bifurcation. Qualitative research has even evolved further and departed progressively. We start to see more critical approaches that stems from interpretism, but with a more social just lens, really to advocate and critique systemic issues. We start to see the emergence and greater respect for more indigenous inquiry. Autoethnography, under the version of new ethnography, has also come to fruition. We have more impressionist research as well. There are more arts-based inquiry as well, where we don't limit our approach to just the spoken word, but also the poetic and the ineffable. We start to see the study of new materialism. Phenomenology evolves into post-intentional. Narrative inquiry evolves into counter-narrative inquiries. And yes, this is probably a good time to probably pause for a second as we dive into our next little activity. At this moment, it's probably good to hear from you again. And again, let's go back to the chat box. I want you guys to read 2 qualitative scenarios. It's not 3, 2 qualitative scenarios below, and really classify them as either an adjective, a method, or a methodology. And do not worry, there is no right or wrong answer. And just digest these 2 scenarios and take the next 2 minutes or so to type into the chat what you think scenario 1 falls under and what you think scenario 2 falls under. And again, there is no right or wrong answer. And I don't even have an answer, to be honest. I have a preference of an answer. Yes. A lot of us will start to sway towards scenario A, scenario 1 as a method, while 2 as a methodology. Nice. Right. I'm assuming everyone had the chance to at least digest the 2 scenarios, and a lot of us will kind of sway that scenario 1 is a method and scenario 2 is a methodology. Now, scenario 1, based on some of the analysis that I've done and a paper and a working paper that I'm putting forward, scenario 1 for me in the qualitative realm, especially when you talk about the qualitative component of embedding some open-ended questions, for me, constitutes as an adjective. When we talk about embed, we tend to mistaken an open-ended question as a method. If you ask any mixed methodologist what they think about scenario 1 and whether the embedment of some open-ended questions constitutes as a mixed methodology, they would tend to sway that the qualitative component is too minute, it's really too minuscule, too granular. It really doesn't necessarily qualify as a method, but it's more attuned to be aligned with an adjective. Scenario 2, a lot of us tend to align it as a methodology. I would argue that scenario 2 is more of a multi-method approach, more methods driven, because a methodology requires certain an additional component of actually having some philosophical commitments. I would say it's a very well thought out research design that uses a multi-method approach, but not necessarily a case study even, because case studies even have certain philosophical boundaries that governs the entire methodology. And again, this is just my take on things according to the definition set up front, and we'll dive into why I believe scenario 1 is an adjective, and scenario 2 is merely a multi-methods, but not so much a methodology. And hopefully the next few slides clarifies a few things. So again, the map is vast, and the next few slides, we're going to look at qualitativity really across the terrain, and really how different qualitative components are embedded according to the 3 terminologies, how methods really differ across methodologies, and we're going to see how different traditions differ in how they pursue that. Let's start with how the components can be embedded. Just like the example earlier, in survey designs, a researcher can really typically embed a few open-ended questions into a more predominantly larger quantitative survey or survey design. And we think about it very carefully, that particular qualitative component, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, is really not big enough or not substantial enough to be considered as a method or a methodology. It's really too small of a component. It's even too small to be classified under a mixed method design. If we move across the terrain downwards a little bit, we can see that the qualitative component evolves into a method when we start to put in more intention to how we collect that qualitative data. For example, a researcher might design an entire project around semi-structured interviews. He may adopt a particular a priori, such as a pre-established theory or model, to really anchor down the inquiry. Now, this is what I will classify really as a method and not so much as a methodology, because it's really considered very conventional, very traditionalist. It carries also a lot of traits from the positivist orientation. At the same time, it tends to attain breadth over that. Now, it starts to evolve into a methodology when you start to see the philosophical commitments of the design being embraced. For example, in ethnography, a researcher might invest to really have a prolonged engagement in the field or a particular culture or a particular subculture over 12 months. She observes, she speaks, she conducts formal interviews, she collects relevant artifacts, she keeps a journal, and then she really writes and memos to herself before, during, and after the journey. Ethnography would be classified as a more robust methodology. And it's also known to be the gilded methodology for qualitative inquiry as a whole. As we move a little bit further, let's start to talk about how different methods travel across the terrain of qualitative inquiry. When we think about deductive designs, let's use the method of interviews and dialogues as an example. In deductive designs, we may embed, we may basically conduct an inquiry with 20 participants using a similar semi-structured interview protocol. It can be designed with an a priori. Of course, we tend to audio tape, we tend to transcribe, we move forward. In this case, we start to see that the interview follows a more positivist tradition in the deductive design. This is also tend to be the type of inquiry adopted by beginners when embarking on their qualitative journey. It's considered very conventional, a very good starting point, but it doesn't necessarily satisfy the qualitative paradigm that we live in the 21st century. When we move down the line just gradually into the interpretive realm, we start to see interviews take on a different approach. Here's an example. A narrative inquirer, for example, may want to understand the experience of being a graduate student. She interviews 5 graduate students, each on 3 separate occasions. She prepares an interview protocol with storied elicitation techniques for the first interview, asking her participants to visualize their lives as students, as a story. Her subsequent interviews were more emergent, following the threads from the first conversation. A final project was written as a story because narrative inquiry follows the philosophical commitments of narrative theories. We start to see the interviews change in form when it travels across the terrain. When we travel even further down the progressive line, let's see how interviews take place in autoethnography, for example. Using a real example, a former chef who is making a career transition into academia, Adrian wants to understand this career transition process. He first introspects his subjectivities. He introspects his positionality as a chef transitioning. He casts the research eye upon himself, as an autoethnographer would say. He dialogues with one additional participant with similar experience, a fellow former chef who made the transition. All the dialogues or the quote-unquote interviews were interactive, conversational, and tailored specifically to their relationship and their built rapport. Adrian wrote his final manuscript as a story from his point of view, because his story is equally important as his participants. And this is based off a true published story by Adrian Woodhouse from New Zealand called A Culinary Story, available on Scope Learning. So we see how the methods change throughout the process, but now let's start to see how each tradition attains depth. One of the biggest misunderstanding, I would say, is on the idea of data saturation. Data saturation is a concept founded by grounded theorists Glasser and Strauss, sometimes also referred to as information redundancy. It's basically the idea that we collect data until the project or the study has reached what we call insightful capacity. It's indicating that enough data has been collected and that no new insights were found. The problem I have with data saturation is that we tend to use somewhat of a bastardized version of it in today's social science inquiry. It's important to first understand where data saturation and how, where it comes from and where it originated from. It really originated from a more rigorous concept called theoretical saturation, referring to a stage where the research theory findings or exploration becomes fully developed. Insofar that the researchers constructed categories, all the dimensions between and within them, all the concepts between them becomes fully developed. It's an indicator of a coherent theory. Today, we are seeing data saturation used in two problematic ways. The first way, I like to call it the hi, how are you experiment. Today, we tend to see saturation being achieved in a sense that we are more likely to saturate the instrument rather than the phenomenon under study. What do I mean by that? And let's take a look at how the hi, how are you experiment takes place. In a classroom or in a group setting, simply ask the question, hi, how are you, to the first person. You probably get a response like, I'm fine, thank you. Quickly move to the next person, hi, how are you? I'm good, and you? Hi, how are you? Move again. Good, how are you? Hi, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. And at this point, this is definitely an over-exaggeration of how saturation is met. But we are more likely to be saturating the instrument that we are using in the research project, rather than saturating the phenomenon that we are trying to get a full grasp of and understanding of. In the words of Janine Moss, she mentioned that sometimes we need to shift our perspective away from the heard it all, that we have heard it all, but really ask the question, have we asked it all? If we only ask a semi-structured interview and we follow it very structurally, we would tend to reach a false claim of data saturation. The second more problematic way saturation is used is what I call fraudulent declaration. Here, the researcher will merely claim to have reached saturation, but did very little effort, if any, to attain it. We tend to see certain projects or certain manuscripts that claim saturation, but did they really achieve it, or did they just declare it? Saturation becomes this little checkbox, a tokenistic statement to be included in many methodological sections. And while it is very difficult to really evaluate saturation based on what the researcher has claimed, it is, however, identifiable if you review the quality of the findings. In other words, sometimes you can really tell whether a study is conducted with rigor and that it really achieves saturation, and when it does not, you know it when you see it, especially when you dig deep into the findings, whether it's insightful. Sometimes the findings may even be too thin. So back to saturation, another issue is that we tend to put saturation on a pedestal, claiming it as the gold standard for all qualitative inquiry. Glasser and Strauss specifically even mentioned that saturation tends to travel very well among the gray area and the positivist tradition, but not so much amongst the interpretivists and its progressive departures. A wonderful study, a wonderful manuscript conducted by Brown and Clark, two synonymous names to thematic analysis, has a wonderful article called To Saturate or Not to Saturate, that really digs deep into the history of saturation and how it has really diluted over the years. Saturation is not the only way to pursue rigor or depth. Take, for example, narrative inquiry. We typically don't pursue the concept of saturation, but we strive for different ideals, such as verisimilitude, the idea that the story we have portrayed or the report that we told really reflects the real world or the real lived experience. We ask questions like, does the reader gain a vicarious entry into a trustworthy story? Does the paper account for the cultural, social, individual, or communal sense of the real world? There are also other ways to pursue depth in narrative inquiries. We check whether it has aesthetic merit. Does the inquiry succeed aesthetically? Does the use of any creative practices open up the text, invite interpretations? My favorite theoretical term is by Laura Richardson, and she mentions for a narrative inquiry, Is the text artistically shaped, satisfying, complex, but most importantly, not boring? Does it have impact? Does the inquiry affect me not only intellectually, it doesn't only move the mind, but moves the body? Does it generate new questions? Does it move the reader to action? Autoethnographers Arthur Buckner and Caroline Ellis says that a good study should move the mind as well as the belly. Hold me by the heart and break it, only to put it back together. Depth in critical inquiry, if we move across the line once more, ask different questions when we pursue depth. It really pursues more emancipatory ideals and promote progression and change. For example, a critical inquirer, when pursuing depth, will ask the question, have we given voice to those who are historically silent or marginalized? Have we provided sufficient depth, logic, and evidence to promote change against dominant ideologies? Does the research carry the necessary rigor and substantiation to promote equitable and socially just progression? By going through all this terrain, the full terrain, I really hope that at least we have uncovered a big dangerous misunderstanding or unpacked one, that qualitative inquiry should never be a one-course stop. It can never be taught by one class and one class alone. I sometimes ask the question, why is it that a graduate student can easily follow a stepwise pathway from introductory stats to more advanced stats courses, but never much so for qualitative inquiry, especially if you're housed in hospitality and tourism? I think boils down to a systemic structure that a lot of the business programs and hospitality programs adhere to that really requires reevaluation. Because in essence, qualitative inquiry is really about a process of getting lost, to be found again, only to be lost, to be found reiteratively over and over again. As I leave this presentation on a last note, I want to unpack just one final dangerous misunderstanding. Throughout this presentation, you notice that we talk a lot about the three terrain, across the terrain, with interpretism, positivism, and departures. It's a big, dangerous misunderstanding here. We need to remember that just because a person is conducting an inquiry using interviews doesn't naturally qualify the person as an interpretivist, or doesn't necessarily mean that he's following an interpretivist framework. A person, just because, and likewise, when a person is engaged in quantitative inquiry, doesn't necessarily mean that they are a positivist. Social life is much too complex to classify them into these finite categories. For example, a person can really be a positivist researcher, but carry a very powerful interpretive outlook on life. And really, depending on the topic, this person can turn critical and really depart into the realm of different things, especially when the topic matters near and dear to the heart. We're about almost there to the Q&A sessions. I'm going to stop the presentation from here and the slide share from here. I have listed some recommended books. I'll definitely share with Dr. Ma the PowerPoint slide later. I know that was a mouthful and a full 45 minutes. And at this point, I just want to open for Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think you gave us a whole lot to think about, to comprehend. We're definitely very stunned by everything you just presented. And I absolutely realize how little I know about qualitative inquiry. So now floor is open. Ask questions. You can type in the chat. You can directly speak up. Yeah.
Yes, I have a quick question. I wanted to sort of ask, when did the shift from sort of the objective, positive realm to the more realism realm sort of take place, and why did that shift, or why did that move, do you believe?
Well, if we actually really think about the shifts, I think Denson and Lincoln really maps out the history of qualitative inquiry beautifully. And that he maps, I think there's like 14 moments now. It used to be 3 moments of qualitative inquiry. I think the latest edition now, there's 14 pivotal moments. And they really write it from the American perspective, right? I think from a social science lens specifically, I think speaking from a hospitality and tourism lens is important. We need to remember that hospitality evolved from either 3 ways: a vocational lens, where we are there to meet the industry, and before we became a university status. And to attain university status, what happened was we tend to start to bring in the lens from the business field into the qualitative vocational context. In doing that, we adopted that full objective, numbers-centered, strategy-centered lens and really ground in full realism. The shift starts to detach a little bit when we start to appreciate the humanities roots. I would argue that only recently in the 21st century, very much later than the broader social sciences. The other lens that we have also contributing to the positivist dominance is that we also come from a home ec background, especially throughout the South. Programs from home ec backgrounds, when it starts to be dissolved and they start to scramble to really evolve into the situations that they were in, became more hospitality focused, and they start to adopt the processes from the business school itself. The third that we are seeing is standalone, the standalone programs that really start to come about later, not coming from the home ec realm and not coming from the vocational realm. The ones that are established much more newly in the past 3 decades, I will argue, especially from the East as well. What happens is, during this particular time, we start to see the movement of doctoral graduates, particularly from the West, entering the East. And they bring, again, the classic conventional ideals to the East. What we see in the East is very lacking of an interpretivist lens, but more favoring towards the positivist lens, the objective lens. So speaking from a hospitality and tourism perspective, mainly hospitality perspective, this would be the real, we're only starting to see this shift more recent. People are reading outside of the discipline, I would say arguably in the past decade. Tourism was a whole different beast that stems from a social science lens. So I would say they are much more grounded with the overall moments described by Denson and Lincoln.
All right, thank you so very much.
Yeah, it's a great question. Great discussion. We see a lot of great feedbacks in the chat as well. Definitely very engaging. I think you just really left us a lot to, really, I think a lot of people gonna go back to the recording, watch this again, take more notes. I know I took a lot of screenshots for more isms and logies and like things to look more into. Yeah, any more questions from the audience or in the chat? And I'm reading what Amelia said over here that, yeah, like, I think we all really appreciate that you showing how rigorous qualitative research is. And early in the career, general feeling was unless you're doing statistical, gymnastics, it's really hard to get published. Absolutely. Absolutely. I
Like
think
the loosened term of gymnastics.
Sean,
yep. Sorry, somebody.
I'd love to. Yeah, sorry, it's Fred. Can you hear me first?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sean, I really love the way in which you put all the different methods across the wide spectrum from positivist, interpretive, etc. I've never seen that done before, and I think that was beautifully done. But I would love to see you make a presentation at ICRE or at regional CREs on the last piece you did, which is fascinating, about how the different methods and the different approaches come out of hospitality or out of culinary or out of tourism or out of classical business models. I've never seen that done. I think you should write that up as a research note or something, but I think most students who are starting to do research can't figure that stuff out and would love that kind of perspective. I mean, I spent 15 years at NYU teaching research methods, and they always went into like, well, qualitative is no numbers, which is totally wrong. Until you get them into the middle of doing something. But I think that notion of, if you're in a business framework, or if you're in a hospitality framework, or in a tourism framework, you're automatically thrown into different perspectives. I encourage you to do more with that. That's really an interesting piece. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Fred. I wouldn't take any credit. There is a wonderful scholar, a wonderful book chapter that has written about the history, or the undocumented history of the hospitality education. Jeffrey Cartret, not sure whether you've heard.
Right. But bring your perspective to go. Keep it going and bring your perspective to it, because what you're introducing is a fresh perspective. So you can do it. And the way it would be fascinating to pull it apart, now that we have so many more graduate programs in event management, which sort of neither tourism nor hospitality nor whatever, and no one's ever done it with a culinary perspective the way you started. And only a pastry chef knows the value and importance of numbers and exactness.
Yeah, we are walking calculators, I would say.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dr. Mayo.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Sean and I actually know each other back in one of the GradCon, and I approached him because I was just very discouraged to do any qualitative research in my PhD, and I saw someone we are relatable in a lot of different levels, but also have the courage to actually be brave enough doing qualitative research and do it so well, right? He's amazing pastry chef. You will go to any of his social medias and look at the candy art, or however you call it more professionally, all the arts that he does, not just food from that point, is art. So yes.
I thought we bonded over beer and not research.
Yeah, I know. All of them, beer and research. So yeah, any other questions? This is an extremely engaging session, and I really appreciate everybody here. Well, if not, I will stop recording here. Well, again, thank you, everybody.